What country in Group B of the 2026 World Cup has the most players that were actually born in that country? I'm continuing my series. Group A is my last video. Now we do Group B, which is made up of Qatar, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Canada, and Switzerland. This is a very interesting group to go over. As I say in all my videos on this subject, I do not want to make it come across that I believe that birthplace is an indicator of nationality. I just think it's really interesting to understand where players who play for these countries are born. Why are there more or less players born in other countries? And also just to understand the FIFA global soccer machine. Let's start with Switzerland, who has the most players on their 26-man roster who were born in their country. There are 3 players that were not born in Switzerland. One of them is Brielle Mbolo, who was born in Cameroon. Mbolo moved to France at age 5 when his parents divorced and then moved to Switzerland 1 year later. So he was raised mostly in Switzerland. That's why he decided to play for the Swiss national team. He made headlines in the 2022 World Cup when he scored the only goal in a matchup between Switzerland and Cameroon and did not celebrate against his kind of home country, his birthplace country. Switzerland also has one other player that was born in Cameroon, as well as a player that was born in England. Canada's up next with the most players born in their country. 19 out of the 26 players on the World Cup roster were born in Canada. It feels like mostly in the Toronto area out of those Canadian guys, but there were 7 that were born in other places. You have 3 guys on the roster that were born in England that had some sort of Canadian ancestry. One guy was born in New York City. That was Jonathan David, who moved to Haiti and then immigrated to Canada. And then 3 other guys that were born in different African countries. One in Nigeria, one in Ivory Coast, one in Ghana. And that Ghana-born player was Alphonso Davies, one of the best players for Canada, probably the best. And his story is kind of exemplifies what it means for these international-born players to represent Canada. Davies' family is Liberian, and he was born in a refugee camp in Ghana. His family came to Canada because there was a gateway to immigrate there, and they went to Edmonton, Alberta. It's a really interesting story, and a story that a couple of the other players have similar kind of pathways to how they came to Canada when they were young, because that option was there, and because Canada took them in, and they also were mostly raised in Canada, they feel Canadian and want to play for the Canadian national team. Qatar has the 3rd most native-born players in this group. They have 12 players that were born in Qatar and 14 that were born outside of the country. I got 3 from Sudan, 3 from Egypt, Somalia, Portugal, Algeria, Senegal, Brazil, Belgium, and Ghana all represented. And it's a very unique reason. Let me get into it. If you know anything about Qatar, it is a pretty small country, only 300,000 people there, but there's a lot of money in Qatar, as we learned in the 2022 World Cup. So in the mid-2000s, Qatar realized that they just didn't have a big enough talent pool. They invented Aspire Academy. And Aspire Academy is essentially where, like, FC Barcelona, Real Madrid, all these international clubs have their own scouting networks. They go out, they go to Argentina and find a kid like Lionel Messi. Well, Qatar didn't have big enough clubs to do that. They didn't have clubs that had the infrastructure to do that. So they just took it upon themselves to kind of do the same thing and go to places where athletes weren't necessarily going to get recruited from an FC Barcelona and be able to see if there was young talent in places like Sudan or Egypt. So when scouts recognized a young player in Somalia or Egypt or Sudan that they thought could play at Aspire Academy, they would bring them to Qatar. And then at 13, 14, 15 years old, these kids would grow up and become naturalized citizens in Qatar and then decide to play for the Qatari national team. It's a really interesting strategy. Certainly, it could be a little polarizing, but Qatar, once they got the 2022 World Cup especially, they wanted to beef up their national team to be competitive on the global stage, and they found a way to do so. They've also really beefed up their domestic league, which has brought in some players fairly young, and then again, they've lived in the country long enough to become naturalized citizens and thus represent the Qatari national team. And finally, we have Bosnia, and Bosnia is one of the most unique circumstances. I thought most of the 26 would be born in this country, but it was not that way at all. Just 10 out of 26 guys were born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and let me tell you why. It's kind of similar to Canada, but it's also really different. Let's go through it. First, we got to take a quick history lesson and meet Slobodan Milosevic, who was leader of Yugoslavia during the 90s and a horrible person. He waged war and genocide on the Bosnians from 1992 to 1995, essentially, and obviously through that led to a huge fleeing of people from Bosnia, especially to other European countries. Germany took in a ton, as well as Sweden, Switzerland, and a few others. Here you take a look at the Bosnian diaspora around the world as a whole. Take out Turkey because that's mostly Muslim Bosnians that moved to Turkey at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, end of 1800s, Croatia and Serbia because they're close, but 4 through 10 there, that is all or mostly because of people fleeing Bosnia during the war in the early 90s. And as I look at my notes, of the 16 players that were not born in Bosnia, 4 were born in Germany, 3 were born in Sweden, 2 in Austria, 2 in Slovenia, Serbia, Croatia, Denmark, and Appleton, Wisconsin, as well as Switzerland, all represented. Let's take, for example, Esmir Baratarovic, who I think I'm butchering a little bit the pronunciation there, but he was born in Appleton, Wisconsin. He's that Wisconsin kid that came up in the New England Revolution Academy, made his professional debut for the Revolution in MLS, but when it came time to choose a national team, he chose his parents' Bosnia and Herzegovina to play for because they fled the war. They fled Bosnia, came to Wisconsin, and he was raised in a household speaking Bosnian, being immersed ethnically in that culture, and so it makes sense for him to represent his parents' country, especially because that it's more stable now to represent and something that he feels comfortable representing. It's an interesting storyline, especially in juxtaposition to the Canadians that were born outside of the country that came to Canada and wanted to represent the country that embraced them and became like home, where the guys whose parents left their country still want to go back and be able to represent their country. Obviously, I'm not saying any way is right or wrong or more correct or not. I just think it's interesting how these things end up shaking up, especially in the world of global soccer. Please, if you thought this video was interesting, follow along. I'll be doing every group throughout the lead up to the World Cup that starts on June 11th. Let's go. Please let me know what you think in the comments. This was a really interesting group.